Hello and welcome to the Dr. Pepper Museum and Free Enterprise Institute's Professional Development for Teachers in the month of March. We're so excited you're joining us, and because it is Texas History Month, we have invited the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and Museum to join us for this professional development. So we'll be talking about Texas history. That will have our guest speaker, of course, Aubrey from the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and Museum, talking about resources that they offer at their museum. Our museums are very close together, and in Waco, a lot of our museums collaborate to help each other be better as a community. And so we're really excited to have Aubrey here to share those resources. And then I'll be talking about some of our resources that we have for Dr. Pepper, but also really sharing how we teach Texas history here and some techniques for our storytelling that we do that you could apply to your classroom. So even if you're not a Texas history teacher or a teacher in the state of Texas, there's a lot of things you can glean from this. So I hope you enjoy it today. Join us next month for another virtual professional development, because we do have them each month. And they're all posted on our website and through our newsletters. Next month, we'll be talking again with the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and Museum with Aubrey over there, where we are going to talk about ways to incorporate history content into other subjects and using examples from both Dr. Pepper history and the Texas Rangers. So how can our museums help you? Both museums have a lot of things to offer you. I think you'll find that any museums, libraries, nonprofits in your area probably have resources for you, and we're all eager to help. We are here for you as teachers, and so we want to be able to support you. And so the ways that our museums do this, the Dr. Pepper Museum has virtual teacher professional development, free classroom resources, a virtual field trip, which you can download on our website, and field trips in person when the situation allows. And so we do have a lot of different resources for you, of course, including videos like this and our newsletters that have highlights of these other things that we offer. And of course, you can always reach out to us or other museums in your area to find out more about what we offer you and how we can work with your classroom, especially during this very strange time. So why teach Texas history? For many of you, this is a required standard. You might even be teaching Texas history as a 4th or 7th grade teacher in the state of Texas. But also, even if you're not in the state of Texas, which there are a lot of our viewers aren't, we do have, as Texans and as the state of Texas, great examples of many economic, social, and historic concepts. So if you aren't in our area, but you're interested in how countries are formed or how revolutions happen, and you want an example that's not your state or the country, Texas is a great example. We have a unique history that can be connected to a lot of different other examples in other subjects and other regions. And so if you are supposed to teach Texas history, that's one thing. But even if you're teaching in another region of the country, or you're maybe teaching a different subject, Texas history is a great example for many things that you'll be teaching in your classroom. The other thing is local history. Both the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and Museum and the Dr. Pepper Museum teach about local history. We highlight what's important about our community and the history right here in our city. Now that is incredibly important because it connects what you're teaching in your classroom to your students' lives. So if you're not local to Waco, please use what we're talking about as an example for what you could do in your community. If you are from Waco or in our area, we hope this is a great resource for you to teach about your community. It's really important to connect your students to their local history, because a lot of times we spend time talking about the overarching country or the state that they're in or the world, but we don't look right in our backyard. And I think you'll find that wherever you're living, no matter where it is, your community has some really interesting history. And it shows students that where they live is important and that they're a part of a big story. And I think that students find that whenever lessons become much more relevant because it's their area, they'll be more invested in history. A lot of times history content is very obscure. Students feel like they're not connected to it. It's something that happened long ago in a place far away that I'm never going to go. It doesn't apply to me. When you connect it to their community, that changes everything. So please teach Texas history or consider teaching local history in your own area. So here at the Dr. Pepper Museum, we teach how economics works through the story of Dr. Pepper and the soft drink industry. And we do spend a lot of our time teaching about Waco history, our local history. And it begins, of course, with the soft drinks invention in a pharmacy, but then it goes all the way to the modern grocery aisle. And so this is a great story that connects historic concepts to modern day, and it always is something that students can relate to and enjoy, because who doesn't like soda? So while in this professional development, I will be talking about Dr. Pepper's history and what we talk about here at the museum, I really want to delve into how we teach local history here and how we teach Texas history, because the wonderful thing about museums is that we learn to be very engaging. Our guests are not a captive audience. Our students, if you will, can just walk away. They aren't in a desk. There isn't a set time that they need to be there. And so everything we do is very intentional. We know that we need to hook them and we need to persuade them to stay, because this is an educational place. That does take some persuading. And so we work really hard to make sure that our history content that we're teaching keeps them engaged. And I know as teachers, that's something that you do a lot. And I think while looking at other institutions that maybe don't have a captive audience, it's a good way to see what you could do to really engage students in a topic. We also get really good at one particular topic or one category, and do a great job of just testing out ways to teach that concept until we get it right. And our category here is Dr. Pepper history, and so we've learned the best way to talk about it. And we start by setting a scene. We like storytelling here, and so we set the scene. And for us, that scene is the Waco in the late 1800s. And for little kids, we usually talk about the smells, the sights. What do you smell? Like, close your eyes for a second. Oh, I can smell dirt now. Man, that's kind of stinky. What is that? Oh, it's a cow. And you would be amazed at what little kids suddenly think they smell or see. We talk about the clothing that people would wear. We talk about how the little girls in our group would probably be wearing dresses and how the gentlemen in our group would be wearing suits. We talk about the sounds you might hear. We hear a train, we hear wagons, we hear a giant herd of cattle. We really try to set the scene, and that's incredibly important because it gets them engaged. We want the students to step into it. So whatever you're teaching about a topic in your area, but also in general in history, setting the scene is really important. It doesn't take very long, but it helps the students move from just thinking about history content to kind of stepping into it and feeling like they belong there. If this is an area in your hometown or a local area that they will know, show them a modern picture and then an older picture if you have it. It's a great way to kind of set the scene by showing them what an area they know would have looked like. And so try to engage all their senses. I know it's difficult. If you have little ones, you can even bring in tactile and sensory objects to kind of engage them. If they're older students, oral histories and things like that are really easy to kind of rope them in. Again, if this is something that is in an era that's a little bit newer, you might be able to get radio, movies, TV from that decade. And so please go ahead and set the scene. So to set the scene for Waco, like I said, it's the late 1800s in Waco. You can smell dust. You can hear a giant horde of cattle coming down the street. You can smell that cattle. You can hear a kind of like a trolley going by. You can hear a wagon and a horse. You can hear a ton of people in the street because this is a busy area. And then you walk up to the old Corner Drugstore, and that's the setting for Dr. Pepper's story. The old Corner Drugstore is a pharmacy, and this pharmacy is where Dr. Pepper was invented. I always try to explain to kids who might not know, a pharmacy is just like CVS or Walgreens, where you get your medicine, because Dr. Pepper and all soda started as a medicine. And so soda was sold at these pharmacies like a medicine. Here at the museum, we have a model of the old Corner Drugstore, but just as easily I can show them a picture like the one on the screen and tell them to think about what was in here, and then ask them to look at the shelves, look at the signs, look at the advertising in the windows, what's going on here. And they can usually point out things like the items being sold, the people in there. They notice that there's a lot more gentlemen than ladies in any picture with a lot of people. They'll notice the skin tone of the people in the pictures. They notice the things being sold. They notice the pharmacy, of course, but they also see the soda fountain, which is the next part of our setting. So we kind of like to zone in on it. So we go from our big smells and sights of the time period and on the street. We go into the building and talk about who's in the building, what are they eating, what are they buying, and then we go to our spot that we're talking about. So after setting the scene, late 1800s Waco, smelly, very Western and Southern feel, we want to move in to the characters so that they have an idea of who we're talking about. I usually treat them like characters in a book, not just people in history. It helps kind of bring them alive and make students invested in those characters. So we have Dr. Morrison, who owned the old Corner Drugstore and named Dr. Pepper. We have Dr. Alderton, who invented Dr. Pepper. He was a pharmacist, and working behind the counter, he would sneak over to the soda fountain and mix flavors, eventually making Dr. Pepper. And then we have Mr. Lazanby, who owned the bottling factory and brought in all that business savvy to make a bottling business out of it. And so we have these three characters in our story, and we want to kind of bring them alive. And so I usually have students act them out for young groups. And then for older groups, I like to bring in some of their stories, a little bit more about them, make these people real. So for example, and again, it doesn't take much, I talk about Dr. Morrison and I say, a lot of people, especially kids, are almost say that it's unfair that Dr. Morrison owned the soda when Dr. Alderton invented it. Do you think it's fair that Dr. Morrison, who owned the store that the soda was invented in, is the owner of Dr. Pepper? And a lot of kids don't like that. It's kind of like an intrigue that he owned the store. He also wasn't actually a medical doctor. At the time, people who were not medically trained could still call themselves doctor, especially if they owned a pharmacy. We also have the fact that he named Dr. Pepper, and there's a lot of intrigue with that as far as why he named it. There's a good story that Dr. Pepper was named after a woman that Dr. Morrison loved. So the story goes that he loved this woman and he named the soda after her to persuade her father to allow him to marry her. And the only problem was that at that time, Dr. Morrison was already married to somebody else. And to our knowledge, we can't find any record of a Dr. Pepper, either Pepper being the last name for the girl or the father. We've done a lot of research here at the museum and have never found any proof to that. We've also had stories that he named it after the Queen's doctor or maybe his pet horse. So there's a lot of different ideas for that. Personally, I just think that he probably, maybe there's pepper in the soda or he saw pepper and doctor to imply health. But then that wasn't interesting enough and wasn't as good of a story, and so he made up stories on his own. But again, that's just my idea. And so adding a little bit intrigue. For Dr. Alderton, we like to talk about how Dr. Alderton was actually pretty young when he worked there. He was a little younger than me, in his mid-20s, and he worked at the soda fountain and at the pharmacy when he was young, but then later became a pharmacist at a prominent pharmacy company here in Waco. And so giving kids and students the story behind a character, what happened to them. Like, this is their role they played in this historic event, but they had a life beyond that. They're real people. Mr. Lazanby is also another really interesting character. He has a wonderful history with the company and has a lot of stuff documented for him. We have a lot of fun stuff about him, but my favorite thing is that every picture he's ever in that we have, he's facing the same direction. Only half of his face is showing. And through a lot of digging, our staff at the museum finally found out that he had an injury on one side of his face that he didn't want in photographs. And so the fact that every single picture he was turned was just curious. And so I usually ask kids why. And then, well, what do you think? Like, oh, it's kind of funny how everyone else in this picture is facing forward, but he is facing the side. And after talking, they can speculate, and that's exactly what historians do. And that's exactly what the historians here at the museum did. And so stories like that make these people real. It's also important to not just have those main characters, those characters in that traditional story that rose to the forefront. Many of them are in our actual standards for teaching listed out, but it's really important when teaching a history content that you're not just talking about those people who rose to the front. Usually white, wealthy, and educated men in many historic contexts, just because those were the people who were being documented. And those are the people who had the ability to write and had their photos taken and were able to sort of make history and be remembered. And so how can we bring out other characters that maybe don't look the way that history at that time wanted it saved, or didn't do what history at the time decided was important to remember? And so how can we kind of pull those stories from the sidelines into the forefront? And that's something that the museum has been really working on with our own Dr. Pepper history. And it's important to teach about those people that weren't main characters until quite recently. And so we actually have a lot of oral histories about some of the people who work here or worked here. One of my favorites is Ellis Booker. He was a mechanic and worked on the bottling lines and was at the factory, which is now the museum building, for decades. And his daughter actually has a beautiful oral history where she talks about her father, and she's talking about when she was young, her dad coming home for work, or the day that her dad was awarded for his work and his time at the factory, and her Christmas gifts that she got from the Lazanby family every year. And these family stories are recorded with local history. And so we want to bring side characters to become main characters, to bring them from the foreground into where we can see them and learn about their history so we can get a more accurate picture of that historical event. Also, students really cling on to these things. For younger students, this may just be bringing up people who maybe weren't the boss, so somebody like Ellis Booker wasn't the inventor of Dr. Pepper. He didn't own the factory, but he did make it possible, and he was an integral part of that factory. And so looking at his stories and seeing his pictures and watching oral histories from his children help us learn about that history, and it's something your students really cling to and remember. With older students, bringing these characters out and asking them, okay, well, why wasn't this person in your textbook? Or why was it harder to find information about them? Okay, maybe that information wasn't saved, or why is it harder? Having that conversation is really important as we raise the next generation of historians. Like, how can we help them understand why it might be difficult to find information about certain people in history? It's not because they weren't important, it's just because it was not recorded quite as well, or maybe not recorded in the way that we typically look for. Another thing that museums do to help engage our guests and our students who are participating in our programs is we talk about the gossip, which I know seems a little redundant, but we don't just talk about the people who maybe aren't in that main character position. We like to talk about the plot lines that aren't always brought to the foreground. What was the gossip going on at that time, or what is the conspiracy theory related to this? It's intriguing, and we as museums cling to that. Guests love it, and we're able to teach our guests, as you can teach your students, how to sift through those things and fact check for yourself. It's a great skill that we hope your students will develop. For us at the museum, something that is of great intrigue is our ghost history. Both museums are certified haunted locations, and we give haunted tours. We talk about ghosts all the time, and we're pretty careful with our field trips. We don't really talk about ghosts and things with our field trips unless the teacher asks. But we do have a lot of our guests interested in our ghost history. And if that's something you feel comfortable talking with your students, find the ghost stories. People love them. And the great thing about these hauntings is you learn about the people who lived in that place, you learn about the things in that area, you learn about why, and it's usually not something spooky, though it is a ghost. It's usually not something tragic or anything like that. It's just the person who lived there and did their life. What would they look like? What would they be wearing? What do they have in common with us today? And so for us, the intrigue is the ghost. We also talk about the rumors around the Dr. Pepper story, or the campaigns that went horribly wrong and offended people, or the way that we've evolved over time, or the flavors that just completely tanked. Talk about the interesting gossip-worthy stuff, and your students will be engaged. The next thing that I'd suggest doing is connect to modern themes. We do this at the museum all the time. We, of course, start with the past, setting the scene, talking about those characters and all of those characters and the plots that go with them. But we also want to connect to the modern themes. We want to relate that story that we're telling to something that's happening today. For example, Dr. Alderton invented Dr. Pepper by mixing together different flavors of syrup, very similar to when a kid goes to the soda fountain and he puts his cup down and he fills it with every single flavor at the machine. Dr. Pepper has 23 flavors. It's very similar to putting every single possible soda in the same cup and then drinking it. And with the same way, kids all of a sudden laugh because they've done that too. A lot of things that I've done in history are very common still today. We also love to talk about different things in advertising. Things like advertisements are always there. So Dr. Pepper advertises their soda as a Vim, Vigor, and Vitality when it was first invented. Caffeine-free, and provides Vim, Vigor, and Vitality to anyone who drinks it. That seems a little silly, but Dr. Alderton created it as a medicine. In the same way, today there are things that are advertised as healthy that aren't. We can talk about persuasive techniques with advertising as well. We can also talk about what a location looks like today. Yes, it's not a modern theme, but how did it change? There are wonderful resources in your community, I'm sure, that have sort of a time portal. They have a picture from the past next to a picture from today, and they show you what it looks like. You can easily do this with your community. Find a picture of a location from an earlier time period. There's a lot of local databases, but also any of your local libraries can probably help you find where you can find these documents. So please go ahead and reach out to local museums, libraries, universities. They have these resources and they're excited to share them with you. Find them and then ask them for some resources to help you connect your community, your local history, with modern day. Now, this can happen with the themes, of course, like advertising, innovation, basic things like how a student will fill a cup with soda, but it can also happen with just how things are evolving. Everything is constantly changing, and that's okay. And having kids understand that a location is the same place, but it looks very different, can be a big step for a lot of students, depending on their grade level, of course, but it's always interesting for everyone to see how an image changes. So we have quite a few of them here, of course, from our Dr. Pepper resources, but we also have local libraries that we work with digital archives. And so the Texas collection here in Waco has a ton of really great stuff, and they always put together these really wonderful pictures of old-time Waco and then fade to a modern picture today. And then you can ask your students what's similar, what's not. Oh, I see that stayed. Why do you think they took that away? Oh, what's different about the road? Oh, it's not dirt anymore. That's good. Is that helpful to you now that your road isn't dirt? Like, are you happy there aren't cattle here? Or, oh, that was so much better looking, right? Like, wow, trends change. Like, talk to your students about the fact that things are constantly changing and they are still changing. Here in Waco, I have a lot of pictures of the roads, let's say Austin Avenue or 5th Street, historically, and then today but imagine what they're going to look like in a couple of months. We are constantly having construction here. In fact, right now, the front of the museum is covered with all kinds of machinery to make that road better and bigger and house so many more people coming through. And we've had the opportunity to talk with guests about how things have changed so much and how they will continue to change. So please try to connect those stories about the past to the present and the future. Those current themes are going to help your students find relevance in your stories, and they're really easy to do. So here at the museum, we engage our guest by setting the scene of our story. We talk about those main characters and find other characters that maybe weren't main characters to begin with, but were so integral and help us see a different side of the story. And so we make sure to set the scene, talk about those characters, even those who maybe aren't at the foreground but definitely could be. And we talk about gossip and intrigue and bring them in with a good hook. And then we bring about the plot and we talk about modern themes in line with those historic content. For us, that's Dr. Pepper's history. Waco being a western town with all those cattle coming in, an important part of the Chisholm Trail. A place where people would go into this old corner drugstore and order a soda as a medicine to help them on their road through town. And there they drank Dr. Pepper, which at the time was called a Waco, and enjoyed it. And they would usually buy that from the inventor, Dr. Alderton, who might also sell them some other medicines at the time. And later, a couple of years later, that business was so profitable that Dr. Morrison and Mr. Lazanby were able to make a factory out of it. And in that factory, you'd see many different people of many different ages and races and genders, and they worked together to make our company. And then as time progressed, this company grew and expanded, not just in Waco anymore, but suddenly it's called Dr. Pepper and it is everywhere. And today you can still see that product. It's easy to do. Set the scene, talk about characters, talk about gossip, and connect to modern themes.
Hello everyone, my name is Audrey and I'm the Education Programs Manager here at the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and Museum, which is a museum in Waco, Texas that talks about the almost 200 years history of the Texas Rangers, all the way from 1823 to the modern day. And that's the law enforcement, not the baseball team. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the resources that we have to help you teach Texas history, though some of the things I'm going to talk about can be used for other history topics as well. Now, I hope some of this helps you, and please take what works for you and leave the rest. I'm not a teacher in the classroom, so I don't know exactly what you need, but I hope some of this does help you out. The first thing I want to talk about is warm-ups. Most of you probably do some sort of quick warm-up to start your day. And right now, the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame Museum does have downloadable for free on our website, which you can see on the screen, journal prompts. And the cool thing about these journal prompts is all of them include an image from the museum's archives, a historical image, and they also include the historical context of the images and a few journal prompts to get your students started. Now, there are a few different ways you can use them. You can download them and print them as is. They come in a worksheet format. You can put the worksheet up on your projector, or you can zoom in on the image, so just the image shows, and give your own journal prompts, or have the students kind of inference what they think is happening with the historical context before actually revealing what's going on. And another great thing about these journal prompts is because all of the images are from our archives, they are considered to be primary sources. They are photographs taken in their time of Rangers doing their duties. So it really is a great way to include primary sources in your warm-ups. Speaking of primary sources, museums have all kinds of different primary sources for you to use and to help your students, and a lot of these would be different than the normal primary sources that you just find in textbooks, which could be fun and different for your students. So museums like the Texas Collection, the Texas Archives, the Bob Bullock, and the Texas Ranger Museum a lot of times have a lot of their archives digitized and their collection digitized for free online. On the screen, you can see an example of one of our digital archives files. So a lot of times these files will have a really nice picture of the object and a little bit about the kind of physical qualities of the object, so what color it is, how big it is, if it's in good condition or bad condition, since a lot of these objects are pretty old. And then also we'll have some historical context. So who made it, who used it, when it was made, and how it was used, that kind of thing. And the great thing about these archives is they include objects as well as things like photographs and letters. So they can be really useful for a lot of different reasons. One way to use these is as another source for your older students who are doing research to find primary sources. Sometimes it can be difficult for students to find primary sources online, and this is a really great way to encourage them to, find those. Now, the other way you can do these is for younger students that are just kind of learning how to do research and write papers. You can have them pick an object or an archival material and have them write a paragraph or two about it. Or you can set parameters and have them try to find something within those certain parameters and test those research skills. Another option would be for you to actually pick the object and have them go and find it, learning how to use online search tools and that kind of thing. The last thing that these digital archives can be used for is kind of like we talked about earlier with the journal prompts. If you find one that looks really interesting, you can always use that as a journal prompt in your classroom. Like Rachel has said before, advertisements can be a really good way to get students to visually engage with history. And news photographs work in a very similar way. So if you take a look at the picture on the screen, this is a photograph of a ranger in the Harper's Weekly magazine during 1861. And for a lot of Americans, this was the very first image they had ever seen of a Texas Ranger. And to engage students with this photograph, you can ask them questions like, what traits do you get from this image? What does this image tell you about the Texas Rangers? Do you think this is an accurate portrayal? Why or why not? What do you think the journalist was trying to say with this image? And images are just a really great way to get students interested in history, and so many images from newspapers, magazines, things like that can be used in this way. Another thing to talk about when you're talking about media images is media bias. So kind of having a conversation about why the journalist chose a certain image and what story they were trying to tell. Going back to the ranger photo, what do you think they were trying to say about the Texas Rangers? What were they hoping people would think about them? And if you want to bring that into the modern day, you can send students home with an assignment to find an example of media bias in their own lives. And this can be in a newspaper, in a magazine, in an online newspaper. I mean, a celebrity period, like tabloids would work really well for this. And ask them why they think the journalist chose that image and what story the journalist was trying to tell. And then talk about how the choices that the journalists make really influence how we learn history, both in the past and today. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the other things that the Texas Ranger Museum has to help you teach Texas history. The Texas Rangers have been around since almost the very beginning of Texas, since Stephen F. Austin brought over the original 300 American families in 1823. So the Texas Rangers can be a very good lens to talk about Texas history too. Not to mention, if you teach 4th or 7th grade in Texas, the Texas Rangers are part of your TEKS requirements. Now, we do currently offer in-person field trips, but we also have virtual presentations. You can find more information about the virtual presentations on our website in the Educators tab, but I'll tell you a little bit about them now. So the presentations can be really tailored to what you need. So typically it's me presenting about the entirety of the Texas Ranger history from 1823 to modern day. But if your students are really focusing on the Texas Revolution or Texas during the post-Civil War years, we can kind of narrow down and get into the details of the Rangers from that time period. Also, we can adapt the presentations to fit your scheduling needs. So if you only have 15 minutes for the presentation, that's fine. If you have 40, we can work with that too. So the presentations are really very adaptable within reason to what you need. Now, we also have a lot of other free to download resources on our website. One of which is the journal prompts that we talked about earlier. All of those are downloadable in worksheet form. We also have quite a few lesson plans that you can download. We have 2 kind of full-size lesson plans and then 5 10-minute lesson plans, because we know sometimes you don't have a lot of time to teach social studies. And all of the 10-minute lesson plans do follow the 5E method and include an activity for your students to do. And these topics range from Texas Rangers in geography, Texas Rangers in technology, the beginning of the Rangers, and the Mexican-American War. Most of these lesson plans are geared towards 4th and 7th graders, but can be adapted to fit other grade levels, and we do have a few lesson plans that fit other grade levels just kind of as they are. Other things you can download from our website is activity sheets. We have activity sheets that are word searches, crossword puzzles, coloring sheets, an at-home or in the classroom fingerprinting activity, and also a really fun worksheet about the art of sound effects. Now, the other thing I want to mention that you can access on our website for free are our videos. We have 2 TV shows right now, Ask the Ranger Museum and Discovering the Legends, that you can view from our website. And the great thing about these is they include a lot of modern primary sources. So a lot of the videos are interviews with Texas Rangers serving today or recently retired. And not only is it just cool to see a primary source that's modern and on video, it can be a way to talk to your students about the fact that they themselves create primary sources for historians in the future. So if they write a letter or write in a journal or even post on social media, all of that in the future can be used by historians to figure out how they lived, which is just kind of a cool, powerful thing to think about. And if you'd like, you can always make an assignment about it to write in a journal about a day in the life to help those historians 100 to 200 years in the future. And all of these videos do have a kind of an organizational guide to them, so you can tell pretty quickly which ones are going to be those primary sources and which ones are presentations by historians, artists, and museum employees, to make it a little easier to figure that out quickly. Now, the other videos that we have is a series called Storytime with Audrey, and that's where I read children's storybooks that have to do with Texas or kind of a Western theme. And some of these books are history-based. We have one about Bessie Coleman, the first Black woman to get her pilot's license, who was born and raised in Waxahachie, Texas. And one about courageous people of Texas, which includes little biographies of people ranging from Sam Houston, Lyndon B. Johnson, all the way up to J.J. Watt. And then we also have retellings, kind of Texas retellings of folk tales. We have one that is posted called Little Red Hot, which is a Texas retelling of Little Red Riding Hood. Most of these videos do have a guide that sorts them into social studies TEKS requirements. And there's a suggestion at the bottom of that guide for questions and kind of discussion prompts to hit some of those English language art TEKS as well. Most of these storybooks are for those kind of younger students, but can be a really good way if you need 8 to 15 minutes of breathing space. You can put those videos on for your students to watch. And that is about all I'm going to talk about today. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions or would like to talk about those virtual presentations, my email is on the screen right now. And again, thanks so much.